So I think a good portion of us are already aware that Sherwin Williams selected this color as their 2023 color of the year. What does that mean? Well, I'll be honest, I'm not 1000% sure, but I have a hunch that Sherwin Williams believes this to be where everything is headed design-wise. That means if you go to your department store or a fancy furniture store or IKEA, you're more likely to see more Redend Point looking items, fabrics, all of that. If you're new to the channel, we talk about painting and decorating related stuff. And what I love to do in this color code series is I start with a color code, in this case, SW9081, Redend Point, and then I break it down for you so you can process what type of color it is and certain ways you could potentially use this color. And then the most important and fun part of it all, I also put together a color palette consisting of 4 other colors ranging from a brighter white to a deep, dark, fun color. And as I get into this color review, I do want to mention that today's video is sponsored by us, the paint people. No actual sponsor today, but if you appreciate what we do, you can do that by hitting that like button for us because it does more than you even know. And you can even become a channel member by clicking the join button. I am doing this full time at this point, so your support is greatly appreciated by me and to a slightly lesser extent, my wife. So Redend Point by Sherwin Williams. Where do we start here? I sort of had a gut feeling that after a year of green, we were staying within the earthy category of colors, but we couldn't have green again, right? So what's earthier than the literal color of the earth? Redend Point ends up being a bit of a blend between brown and a pretty strong red undertone, giving it a somewhat darker mid-tone clay coloration that conveniently is very complementary to last year's color of the year in Evergreen Fog. If you're not too familiar with color theory and all that, complementary might actually be the opposite of what you might think. People might think that complementary colors are the ones that work together really easily and it's all easy peasy because they're similar. They're actually in opposition with one another. So red and green are opposites and therefore they're complementary, which is why you see a lot of red and green during Christmas because they just pop off one another in a really dynamic way. Now, Redend Point has a decent amount of that red within it, more so than you might expect when you see pictures of it rendered online. In fact, I've had situations in the past where someone would want to use a color like this, expecting it to feel like kind of a milk chocolatey cocoa color, only to put it on the walls and realize it's just kind of pink, like it's like a coral color almost. I almost think of this color as less brown and more so rose gold, like it has that sort of aesthetic in some situations. So if you like the sound of that and you're working with perhaps a boho style or something that's maybe Japandi where you want to incorporate a lot of warm, natural looking materials, this could be a good fit for you. But I would caution the rest of you, especially the ones that are more accustomed to softer, more muted, desaturated neutrals that maybe have a little more gray and less of that red undertone. This might give you a result that you weren't expecting, more so than any other brown that I can think of off the top of my head. In terms of how dark the color is, it sits around a 30 LRV, which does put it in the dark third of all colors, technically. This means it will be very noticeable on whatever surface you paint it on because it has that depth. But you also have some of that warmth, which does allow it to feel pretty warm and cozy, which I think makes it an inviting color choice, even on the walls in your more secondary sections of your homes. So think bedrooms, think maybe bathrooms, maybe a section off the dining room. To me, one of the simpler ways to utilize this color is in a more monochromatic fashion where you're working with a lot of other warmer, kind of earthy colors. And that's how I put together today's color palette, with only one notable exception at the end, which happens to be a color that my subscribers will know I'm a big fan of. So we'll get to that later. I guess before we get into the color pairings themselves, I do want to give you all a word of caution here, especially because it was labeled as the color of the year. This doesn't mean that Sherwin Williams has made your decision for you. Now you can just go to the paint store, grab 5 gallons of Redend Point, and start using it all over. This color is merely a piece of a much larger colorful puzzle that individually we're all trying to figure out, even me. But hopefully it can serve as some sort of inspiration and maybe some motivation to experiment with these types of colors, but you shouldn't feel pressured into going into pinky brown territory all over the place either. So where we'll start with is with the white paint color choice, which is an obvious pick, but not necessarily the most clear choice either. It's called extra white, which is one of the quintessential white paint color choices within Sherwin Williams paint. Instead of grabbing the low-hanging fruit and picking something maybe that's a bit browny or a bit pinky or reddish, I went the opposite and chose a crisp and stark white. This will allow the wall color to really stand out and be accentuated by any surrounding white trim. And the two colors may be a tad complementary, but in person, extra white will just be very clean and sophisticated and classy. My light color choice, on the other hand, has more similarities to Redend Point because it is based on a gray-brown coloration. It will feel like the lighter version of Redend Point in a way. The color is called Everyday White, and it's around a 72% LRV, which does put it in that light category of colors, but it's not nearly as bright as the white we just talked about. Here's a color that you can pretty comfortably use in many parts of your home as the predominant color of the palette. It's sort of a taupey grayish color that really works with the neutral palette as a whole, especially on the warmer side of things, and even more especially with your browns and your taupes and anything red related. Moving to our mid-tone color, I opted for a slightly gold-leaning neutral in Sandbar. And to me, it has a tan-like quality on its own, but it doesn't really have a strong, visible color hue either until you put Redend Point next to it. And then Sandbar almost peaks into greeny beige territory, I guess. It won't look green per se, but the red in Redend Point will be that much more prominent, so you could have that interaction between the two if you use them in the same space. Personally, I would keep them separated in different rooms perhaps, but if they are in sightline with one another from a distance, they could really coexist because of that shared kind of sandy, earthy warmth they do have. But you gotta check out the dark color pairing, which is my favorite, definitely the most exciting of the bunch because it's saturated, it's organic, it's also extremely complementary to Redend Point. Remember our Christmas chat earlier? Well, that's sort of what Basil's giving you. It's not quite Christmas green, and Redend Point isn't quite candy apple red, so it won't really have the same effect. But just be aware though that these two colors will be very dynamic and active in how they relate to one another. So in most cases, I will keep them in adjacent rooms that are closed off by a door, or you can have them in the same room, but just make sure you have one in a very small dose, like an accent color within your furniture and your accessories. And that goes both ways. You can use basil on your walls all over and then have those little pops of earthy red here and there for a little fun. Try and play around with these colors using different combinations and ratios. The palette itself is mainly monochromatic, except that bright, bold green at the end. And if you know me, you know I'm a green lover. And I love you for clicking on this video because it happens to be one of my favorite green paint colors out there. I used it in my previous condo, and I honestly think I need to find another reason to use it in this house.